Good afternoon and good morning for those in Asia, and also good evening for those joining from East Coast. I'm Gyuk Shin, Director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center here at Stanford. I hope that you are doing very well despite all the challenges that we have these days at home and abroad. Okay, this is the third in our webinar series this quarter on the theme of shifting geopolitics and US-Asia relations. As you know, we have many challenges facing Asia and US-Asia relations, from the rise of populist nationalism to US-China conflict, and foreign policy and security issues often become politicized. So this quarter, our seminar series address these important issues, and today our focus is on Japan. I'm very delighted to have excellent panelists for today's seminar. I'm especially happy to introduce Professor Kiyoteru. He joined us this fall from Michigan as a senior fellow at Freeman Spogli Institute and professor of sociology. He directs our Japan program and will be leading today's seminar. He's a top expert on Japan, as well as specializing in social movement, human rights, and political sociology. So without further ado, I will now turn over to Kiyo. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Georg, for your kind introduction. It's been a pleasure to be back at Stanford and to direct the Japan program at APARC. And I'm particularly delighted to welcome two experts as our speakers for our first event of the year at the Japan program. And as Georg mentioned, this panel is a part of the APARC webinar series on shifting geopolitics and US-Asia relations. And a lot of things have been shifting in Asia, and particularly so around Japan. And in this changing environment, Japan's foreign policy options have changed as well. And this is a particularly opportune moment to evaluate Japan's foreign policy options, as Japan has a new prime minister, as many of you know, Yoshihide Suga, replacing the longest serving prime minister in Japanese history, Shinzo Abe. And Prime Minister Suga has big shoes to fill, particularly in foreign affairs. And although few would expect a drastic change in Japan's foreign policy under him, Suga is a relative unknown on the international scene, with a number of question marks around his diplomatic skills and foreign policy priorities. And with the Abe era over in Japan's foreign policy domain, what can we expect from the new Suga administration? And what options does Japan have given the shifting geopolitical environment that it's in? Those are the questions that motivate this panel. And more specifically, I have asked our two speakers to address four key questions that orient our discussion today. First is the all-important US-China-Japan trilateral relationship. With the great power competition between China and the US intensifying, how should Japan navigate this treacherous terrain and maintain a strong alliance with the US, which has been the cornerstone of Japan's foreign policy, while at the same time managing important economic relations with China, Japan's biggest trade partner? Second, Japan also has other diplomatic challenges in its neighborhood. And while Prime Minister Abe managed relations with the United States and China very well, his biggest regrets might be in not being able to make any progress on the kidnapping issues with North Korea and negotiations about the northern territories with Russia. And in addition, the relationship with South Korea soured, to say the least, hitting arguably the lowest point since 1965. Would Japan be able to get out of these stalemates in some of those key bilateral relationships with its neighbors? And if so, how? Third, in the broader region, Japan has successfully promoted the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific, FOIP, and formed a potentially powerful partnership with India and Australia to form the Quad, including the United States. And there's even a talk of Quad Plus to include countries like New Zealand and some ASEAN countries that are concerned about China's ambitions. What are the prospects for this arguably more assertive engagement by Japan in the Indo-Pacific region? Fourth, and finally, more broadly at the global level, what role should and could Japan play in multilateral institutions such as the United Nations, World Trade Organization, World Health Organization, and so on, that have undergirded the international liberal order, but have been shaken by disengagement and sometimes even hostility coming from not just Russia or China, but also from the United States? I know that's a lot of questions, and I'm delighted to have our excellent speakers to face the formidable task of addressing these questions. And let me now introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Shinichi Kitaoka, who is currently the president of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, a governmental agency of Japan and one of the most important development organizations in the world with projects in more than 150 countries. He's a renowned political scientist specializing in Japan's modern political and diplomatic history, and he's a professor emeritus at the University of Tokyo. And in addition to his long list of publications and scholarly accomplishments, he has served as a practitioner and a diplomat, having taken on a number of important positions, including Japan's ambassador to the United Nations, president of the International University of Japan, and chair of a number of consequential government committees. Then we have Professor Susan Thornton, who is a retired senior diplomat with nearly 3 decades of experience at the State Department, focusing on East Asia and former Soviet Union countries. She has served in leadership positions at US embassies in Central Asia, Russia, the Caucasus, and China, and served as the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs until July 2018, leading the efforts to navigate the early Trump administration's diplomatic challenges, including crises with North Korea and trade tensions with China. She's currently a senior fellow and research scholar at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale University Law School, director of the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. I'm going to ask the panelists to speak for 10-15 minutes, and then we'll have some moderated discussion and Q&A session. So audience, please do submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And now, without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Kitaoka. Kitaoka-sensei.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tsutsui, for a very, very kind introduction. Let me first look at how the world is changing with this COVID-19. You know, the damage of COVID-19 can be compared with the World War II, World War I, Great Depression. As you may remember, after these big changes, there was a considerable change of the world took place. After World War I, great empires disappeared. German Empire, Austria-Hungary Empire, and Russian Empire. And then US, there was a rise of the United States. And after Great Depression, there was a remarkable rise of the totalitarian states. And then, and also relative decline of democratic states. And after World War II, of course, there was the establishment of US hegemon as a hegemon, and also Soviet Russia also established its position as a leader of the rest of the world. Now, what is important is that, that those big historic events, the changes after these historic events are usually to accelerate what had been taking place before the big event. You know, the great empires are already declining, and also the totalitarian system was on the rise before Great Depression, and also there was a rise of the United States before World War II. Now, what can be compared today? Rise of China, which is has been accelerating for decades, and now whether China is going to dominate with some exaggeration the world or not will be the key question in front of us. Now, going back to your question, your first question. In Japan, there were a couple of developments in security policies under Prime Minister Abe, represented first of all by the adoption of the 2015 Peace and Security Law, in which it became possible for Japan's self-defense forces to work together with the US military, not within Japan's territory, but beyond Japan's territory, in the vicinity of Japan's territory. The US ships, for example, which is behaving to protect Japan, if it is attacked by some country, then Japan can go to work together to fight against that threat. This can be a counter argument to what Mr. Trump says usually, that he believes it's unfair that if US soldiers are fighting and then Japanese people are watching it on the television, but it is not likely to take place because we have a new security law, 2015. This is the most important development, and to which then Chief Secretary of Cabinet, Mr. Suga, was very much supportive. I knew that because I was one of the insider in this process. That's one thing. But because China's rise was more, rapid and more high-handed, therefore many things have to be done in the future. The most urgent issue is how to create a more effective deterrence power against China. And in it, one important factor is how to, make an effective change of the division of labor between Japan and the United States. Traditional division of labor is that US carries on offense, Japan defense, but it will not work very well. We have to have a more effective combination. And in it has to be included that a change of a traditional policy of Japan. In Japan, we have a traditional, and then I'd like to call strange policy of defense only. Defense only strategy does not work at all. Therefore, we have to Japan has to have some strike power against some of the countries. That's our next target. And then I think Mr. Abe Mr. Suga understands that necessity, but I'm not sure if he's really willing to tackle on it. But now, secondly, the relationship with our neighboring countries. As you pointed out, the difficult relation with South Korea and the kidnap issue, the rising threat from North Korea, and then Russia. I would like to say that in South Korea, there are two groups are competing. The one group is they are feeling comfortable to be obedient to China. Korea has been living in more than centuries, 10 centuries or more, under the umbrella of Chinese hegemonic system. Chinese world order, they had a comfortable place next to China. And some of them are feeling familiar with this comfortable in this system. Those people are very kind to North Korea, despite of their, provocative policies. And on the other hand, the other half is, they are feeling the relationship with the United States crucial to the security of South Korea. And those people need to think, they feel that the improvement of relationship with Japan is imperative. But there's nothing we can do from outside. So we have to wait and see what is going to take place in South Korea. Kidnap issue, no easy solution at all. And the Northern Territory issue, no easy solution at all. My recommendation is just to freeze. Against China, if the good relation with the United States is the first important principle for Japan's diplomacy, the second important principle is no direct conflict with China. Now China-US relation is deepening, but we are in front of this confrontation. So definitely we are on the side of the United States, but we cannot make a, we should avoid provocation of China as far as possible. We have to have a very patient approach to China. In addition to that, decoupling is impossible. Total decoupling is impossible, but some kind of, I hope, establishment of a new COCOM or CHINCOM might be necessary. The restriction of the trade on the sensitive goods of dual use. But anyhow, we are trying to avoid the confrontation as far as possible. That's why we are still thinking about inviting Xi Jinping to Japan as a national guest. On the other area, I think contrary to the introduction by Tsutsui-san, I think Japan's relation with the Southeast Asian countries, particularly Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, is most important. Because if these areas are going to fall under the influence of China, the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, will be separated into parts. So this will bring a very difficult thing to Japan's sea lane. Therefore, the very important thing is how to strengthen our relationship with those countries. My plan is that there should be, in the future, the establishment of the Western Pacific Union, like EU or AU, with Japan and also Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar. The population of those countries constitute over 650 million, roughly half of China. And then my idea is that we do not include China or United States because, it's very difficult to have effective regional organization with superpowers. And then this is like EU. And also Japan-US relation is something like NATO. This is important because, the Quad, Japan, India, US, Australia. This is, of course, again, very important. But in terms of population, Australia is just 25 million. And then if added New Zealand, then 30 million. Cannot be compared with those ASEAN countries. And India is also a self-reliant country. It is very difficult to harness India, but we have been maintaining a very good relation with China. So we can communicate with India, and their independence, prosperity is very important for security. So we can go together. Japan will have a good relation with India, and the US has a good relation with India. So my idea is not consolidate free and open Indo-Pacific, but also separate approaches, multi-dimensional approaches to this area. 1 minute for the United Nations, the global system. Now what we have to understand is that, in those organizations where one country has one vote, now China has almost support of the majority countries because most of the countries are not very democratic or not very prosperous. That's why I believe that the UN Security Council reform movement, which took place in 2005, I was one of the insider, was an important one. So we have to have powerful countries in Security Council so that we can support the United States when the United States was right. And then we have to stop them if they are not right. Anyhow, if those organizations are decided, influenced by China with very many supporters of the small and developing countries, that's, it's very difficult to reform those international organizations. So we have to work harder. And then, unfortunately, President Trump's activities are quite often violating the rules in those multilateral organizations. So instead, we have to work together with the liberal democracies, with a group of liberal democracies. Otherwise, those international organizations will be taken by China, other authoritarian countries. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kitaoka Sensei. We definitely want to come back to the idea of the Western Pacific Union. That's a very intriguing proposal. Now I'd like to turn it over to Susan, Professor Thornton.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kiyo, for having me for this very timely, I think, and fascinating discussion. And I'm humbled to be here with Ambassador Kitaoka, and I look forward to learning even more and hearing even more ideas and perspectives from you and from the audience. You know, first, Ambassador Kitaoka spoke about changes coming from COVID. There are also changes taking place in the power alignment in the international system, and this is clearly leading to shifts in US foreign policy and politics. And I'm going to talk about Japan's foreign policy and role in the region, but in doing so, since we're at a pretty pivotal point in US politics, with less than, I think, 20 days or so until our election, presidential election, I will talk a bit about the US impact on the region and how it affects Japan's role going forward. I think, you know, Prime Minister Suga has gotten off to a very good start in managing Japan's foreign policy. And I know people say that he doesn't come in with a lot of foreign policy credentials, but it seems to me he's made a good start in taking up where Prime Minister Abe left off. He's, first of all, established rapport with the Trump administration, not necessarily the easiest thing to do for foreign leaders, but he seems to have done that well. Oversaw a meeting of the Quad foreign ministers in Tokyo, is making an inaugural trip to Vietnam next week. So I think he has really effectively signaled Japan's foreign policy priorities, and that the strategy will be one of continuity focused on Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific, but also the strong alliance with the US, et cetera. And I think here I would just like to nod to the important role that Japan under Prime Minister Abe has played to take over as the engine of multilateralism in Asia in the absence of the United States under President Trump. I mean, it's clear to all that we've been less engaged, we haven't been showing up at regional meetings, et cetera. And Japan, especially in keeping the TPP agreement alive under the guise of the CPTPP, but also Japan's continuing push to provide alternative sources of infrastructure finance and construction in Asia has been very helpful. I think this is continued the trend of East Asian integration, which countries in the region, at least people I talk to, they're still seeking that. That's still a goal that they have. And they want to see continued sort of trade, market opening, reforms, and cooperation in the region. So this, you know, clearly is an uphill climb at the moment. And at the outset, it was mentioned that we're facing a lot of backlash in a lot of countries to globalization, rising nationalism, populism. But Japan has really been the exception and has continued sort of charging forward on a lot of these efforts and deserves a lot of credit in this sort of difficult period that we've been facing in the global community. Let me take up the question that Kiyo asked about how Japan should tack between the US and China. I think Japan's ability to manage its relations with both China and the US will actually get easier after the US election, no matter who wins. I think that US-China relations will stabilize somewhat after the election. So it will be relatively easier for Japan to play its role in maintaining the strong US alliance, while at the same time pursuing the stable relations with China that Ambassador Kitaoka mentioned also. This is not to say that US-China relations will be very good in 2021. They will definitely not be good. But it does mean that there will be a somewhat more predictable approach to US foreign policy, especially I think if Joe Biden is elected. Under Biden, I would see immediate priority being given to domestic issues in the US, to restoring alliances, including with Japan and Korea and our other allies in Asia, and multilateral issues like global health. COVID was mentioned, that will be a top priority, but also macroeconomic stabilization efforts in coordinating with the international community, climate change issues, and I think non-proliferation and other multilateral focused issues, I think will be a higher priority than the bilateral US-China relationship for the Biden administration coming right into office. I do expect that the Biden administration would try to open communication between Washington and Beijing, but I think the restoration of that bilateral diplomacy will be incremental, and there are obviously going to be continuing points of major contention. And even under a second Trump administration, I think issues with China are likely to be somewhat more in the background than they have been. I think there will be a lot of domestic issues that will be on the front burner and will be vying for the attention of the populace and the media and time and attention of the government. Things like pandemic mitigation and economic recovery and race relations, Supreme Court fights, and other partisan political issues. So I expect there will be additional actions and efforts on trade with China, but that Trump will not really want to provoke a hot conflict with China and will try to restore some comedy with his friend Xi Jinping. So we'll just have to see whether the Trump administration has taken any lessons from the experiences that they've gotten in this effort so far, whether they change tack or not. But one US-China area that will probably have an impact on Japan, and Ambassador Kitaoka mentioned it, Japan and the rest of Asia actually, is the technology issue and how the export control regime and the splintering of supply chains will affect markets and production and growth and recovery in Asia. I expect the intense US-China tech competition to continue for some time. And I think East Asia will likely feel the most discomfort from that tech competition, however it plays out. I do think the development of some kind of new COCOM regime is probably inevitable, and I expect that the US would be working with Japan and other allies on that. But I think the difficult place to make that work is going to be in East Asia and with the supply chains there. So that is an area that deserves particular attention, I think, going forward. We can talk more about the issues in the China relationship because there are a lot of them, but let me move to the relations that Kiyo mentioned, the stalemate relations. And I actually don't think I can put Japan-ROK relations in the stalemate category because I think we very much hope that it doesn't stay there, although it certainly seems to be stuck there at the moment. You know, I do think that if President Biden is elected, and you know, he wouldn't come into office until January 2021, but I think that improving Japan-ROK relations will be something that they are very intent on seeing improvement in, and I think they will make whatever efforts can be made by the US to get some progress there and some movement. It's not clear at this point exactly what the US could do, but certainly encouragement might have a chance of moving the needles somewhat at least. On the DPRK and Russia, I mean, I have to agree with Ambassador Kitaoka. I think these are long-term issues and they're not going to see quick progress in the short term. I think the kidnapping issue in the context of the DPRK is going to be very difficult to resolve short of other things coming together and seeing progress on the North Korea account. I do expect that Kim Jong-un is probably going to turn the US attention back his way shortly after the election in some form or other, probably a spectacular form, some kind of display. You know, it's hard to say sort of how a new administration will respond to that, but I do think the North Korea problem is a long-term problem, and we need to go back to sort of a multilateral approach, working more closely, certainly with the South Koreans, but also with others in the region to try to figure out a strategy for tackling this issue over the longer term. Of course, if Trump is reelected, I mean, he'll certainly pursue his personal diplomacy again and see if he can't get some traction. I don't have a lot of faith in that kind of approach, but I think this is a long-term problem. It's not going to be solved overnight. And then on Russia, I mean, I hope Japan-Russia relations continue to progress, that those discussions continue. I think it's important to keep Russia engaged and hopeful, and I think Japan can actually be helpful to the US here. I think it's been helpful to have Prime Minister Abe talking to Russia, and you know, even though I don't think that that's really going to necessarily bear quick fruit either, I think having that conversation going is helpful in the region. On the question of the free and open Indo-Pacific, of course, I was involved under the Trump administration in the discussions with Japan that launched actually the Trump administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, and it was very much based on Japan's FOIP concept. And you know, here I think Japan has done and is doing quite a bit. It's launched its quality infrastructure initiative, which I'm sure JICA has had a hand in promoting and implementing. It's maintained leadership on continuing Asian integration, as I mentioned, pushed further trade liberalization, continues to push for adherence to international rules. So I think, you know, for free and open Indo-Pacific, Japan can continue to support ASEAN in pushing this regional partnership. I really am interested in Ambassador Kitaoka's Western Union idea. I've heard other possible formats mentioned for this, for pushing forward the Indo-Pacific concept, including another Japanese interlocutor mentioned an idea about a so-called middle power quad, which would include, I think, even Korea, Indonesia, Australia and Japan, and also might involve India. But the interest was in, similarly, in having a quad that didn't include either China or the US, and that would be a way forward in trying to manage security and other issues in the region a little bit more delicately. And I think it'd be worth talking more about that, because this is the second or third iteration of this keeping US and China out of a regional coordination mechanism that I've heard. I've also heard someone mention the possibility of an Asian version of OSCE on the upholding the rules-based system issue. And I think that would also be interesting to explore. Multilateralism and the construction of new multilateral formats doesn't seem to be in vogue these days, but maybe these are things that could be worked out and could be fleshed out in the future and would get some traction as people look for a way to sort of reinvigorate the international system. And speaking of that, that brings me to Kiyo's last set of questions on global engagement, and you know, what should Japan's role be in protecting the international system and the international order. You know, I think, as I said earlier, Japan's done a really excellent job of keeping the train rolling in what has been a difficult period for US involvement in multilateral institutions. And, you know, I hope Japan will keep doing that. If Joe Biden is elected, I think Japan can do a lot to bring the US back into a leadership position in the international system. You know, Japan would probably accept US return to leadership positions in the international system more readily than, say, our colleagues in Europe would at this point. I'm sure they would eventually accept it, but Japan would be sort of ready and willing, I think, to assist in getting the US, you know, back in good standing in the international institutions. Of course, if President Trump gets a second term, I really think this is going to be very difficult. And Japan's done a good job of keeping the train rolling for the last 4 years, but it's going to be very hard to keep that going for another 4 years of sort of US abandonment of multilateralism. So I don't have a lot of great suggestions there, but I think we do look for Japan's support in bringing us back into whatever institutions we can come back to. And I think I'll just leave it there and see if the audience has some creative comments or hard questions.
Thank you so much, Susan. Both wonderful, insightful presentation, and questions are already flooding in, but I'd like to have a little bit of moderated discussion first. And staying with the first topic of US, China, Japan trilateral relationship, I'd like to ask each of you a question. So Kitaoka sensei, you mentioned in South Korea, there is a basically two schools, pro-China school and pro-US school, and we have to kind of wait and see how things might turn out. Turning to Japan, it seems like maybe there is a similar divide, but it seems to me like it's decidedly in favor of pro-US camp in the Japanese foreign policy establishment. Is it an accurate assessment? And if so, do you think this might change over time, or do you think it will just stay as it is? To Susan, so you mentioned that whoever the next president might be in January, China-US relationship might stabilize a little bit. And let's say if President Biden emerges victorious, candidate Biden emerges victorious and becomes President Biden, then China policy, US relations might certainly stabilize, but not in a way that would make Japanese foreign policy establishment happy. I'm sure you know about this anonymous op-ed YA about how Trump policy toward China might actually be preferable for some Japanese foreign policy makers. So how would, and there are a lot of speculations about what Biden foreign policy might be. And if you could say a little bit more about the stability that Biden would bring to US-China relations, and would that be something that the Japanese foreign policy makers can be happy about or acceptable to them? So Kitaoka sensei first.
As you said, the majority of the Japanese people who are interested in the relation with South Korea are expecting the pro-American sector will prevail. But actually, we do not think it's a better way to stimulate from outside. If we criticize the pro-China group in South Korea, that will have a counter effect. Therefore, the majority of the people are just waiting for them. Then we believe that all the international negotiations are based on very difficult decisions on both sides. Therefore, we'd like to keep on the same track as the Japan-Korea relations, the treaty in 1965, and also Obuchi-Kim Dae-jung agreement in 1998, and also Abe-Pak Geun-hye agreement in 2015. So we are very much opposed to the change from that agreement but actually we are relatively waiting for the quietly the prevalence of the pro-American group in South Korea.
Great. I wasn't clear enough about this. I apologize. So this was more about, where is the China school in Japan's MOFA kind of question. So is there a strong advocate for taking a slightly more pro-China stance within the Japanese foreign policy establishment, which doesn't seem to be the case to me, but as somebody who knows a lot about the internal debate within the foreign policy circles, I'm wondering if there's any discussion about changing Japan's stance, especially when President Trump was talking about increasing Japan's sort of cost share obligations in terms of the presence of U.S. military in Japan and so on. So that was the question, was whether similar kind of divide exists in Japan, like in South Korea, and it seems like it doesn't. So then why is that, and where things might go from here?
In reality, we depend a lot with the trade with China, and then that's why many business people are just willing to maintain the relationship while withdrawing some of the business from China. Also, China is, in a sense, dangerous. I usually say to the people that, as Theodore Roosevelt pointed out, speak softly and carry a big stick, and then you can go a long way. Japan does not have a big stick, so do not shout loudly. That's my recommendation. There are many people who are on the media who are very much willing to tougher against China. And then let's behave like the United States. It's impossible for Japan because Japan is in the front line of the confrontation between US and China. And then if China makes a very bad, if China goes a very dangerous approach, then we will have a big damage. Therefore, we cannot take the same position as the United States. That's what the majority of people are thinking, but they are relatively quiet. So at a glance, those noisy anti-China group they are visible, but actually the majority of the people are relatively searching for a good way to stabilize the relationship with China.
That's great to hear. Yeah. Susan?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question about sort of what Asian and particularly Japan would prefer to see from the US with respect to the relationship with China. I mean, the sense I've gotten from a lot of conversations in the region and with Japanese counterparts is that, they don't want relations between the US and China to be too bad, but they don't really want them to be too good either. And I guess maybe the anonymous editorial writer is in the sort of don't want them to be too good camp. I assume that's the part of the Trump administration's policy that they think is good, which is the one that's being tough, keeping China off balance, pushing back, and sort of carrying the big stick, if you will, in the region. And I think most of the countries in the region are in this same boat. They want to see, they don't want to see US-China instability or conflict, because that would damage their interests in the region, and that would be really devastating, I think, for their interests in the region. But they want to see, things not be too good. They would like to be able to play the seams between the US and China, which is actually gives them a lot more operating and maneuvering room in their diplomacy and their economic relationships, et cetera, and gives them more leverage actually in operating on the international stage. So I think it makes sense to me that countries in the region are looking for a sweet spot, a kind of a Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, just right kind of US-China relationship. But the other thing that, needs to be said and has been said a lot recently is that countries in the region are also worried about the US not sticking around in the region to the extent that they want us to be there, not being engaged enough in the region, not showing up in the region, not being present in the region. And I think on that score, the Trump administration's record is pretty mixed, and they have actually instilled a lot of uncertainty and to some extent in the region. And I think you would see certainly a Biden administration stabilizing the relationship in the sense of having a more orderly approach to it. And I think you would see a more certainly concerted diplomatic approach to the region, to being engaged, to reassuring everybody in the region that the US is going to, you know, it has serious long-term interests in Asia and will be showing up and will be paying attention. You know, we've had this rebalance to the Asia Pacific and the pivot, and then we've had this Indo-Pacific strategy. And, you know, people in the region can see that the US has made these efforts, at least rhetorically, to shift resources to the Asia Pacific, to prioritize it in our foreign policy, but we haven't really actually managed to follow through. We haven't put our money where our mouth is. You know, showing up at regional summits has been a difficult proposition in some cases. Moving money into assistance programs or infrastructure support, like what Japan has done, has not always come about in the way that those of us who worked on Asia and tried to make this happen would have liked to see. So I think there are doubts about US staying power. I think there's worry about, you know, how destabilizing is the US going to take the relationship with China, and is that going to have negative spillover effects? But all the same, I think countries in the region want to see the US standing up to China and keeping a balance in the region. And I think, you know, to some extent, either Trump or Biden would do that. I think Biden would do it in a more understandable way, and Trump might do it in a more chaotic way. I'm not sure that would be better, but I think probably people like, in some respects, the sort of tough pushback approach of the Trump administration, even if it hasn't really brought about that many tangible gains or accomplishments.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to integrate some of the questions from the audience, and there have been a number of questions around Taiwan. Taiwan has been on a lot of people's mind in terms of security issues in East Asia. Hoover Institute is having a series on Taiwan specifically, which is probably not it's kind of alarming that we have to spend a lot of time discussing Taiwan in this regard. And the questions revolve around, for Kitaoka sensei, if there is a real military conflict, the Chinese invasion or attempted invasion, and the US bases are also military struck, what would Japan's response be in such an event? And would the response under Prime Minister Suga be different from that from Prime Minister Abe, what Prime Minister Abe's response would have been? I guess we'll start from there.
Okay, let me ask, let me respond to your question about Taiwan. You know, legally, as I said, if the American ships are behaving in the vicinity of Japan, and then to protect Japan, if US military is involved in a conflict with China, then Japan is able to support US activities. Legally, it is possible. Therefore, it really depends on how serious the United States will go to face with China. If you are really seriously including the possibility of real fighting, then there's no other choice than supporting US from Japan. That's Abe or Suga. They may choose that choice.
Great. And to Susan, how would, a lot has been said about efforts to prevent any kind of miscalculation on the part of China and to prevent Chinese sort of proactive, aggressive engagement regarding Taiwan. What can the United States do more to prevent and enhance the deterrence capabilities regarding Taiwan?
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about these issues recently. And of course, the US, Taiwan, China triangle has been, you know, a very sensitive issue and an issue for intensive government management on the part of the US for now 40 odd years. and counting. I think, you know, the most important thing is to try to maintain accurate signaling about, you know, because each side is trying to alter the status quo a little bit, right? You know, the Chinese side obviously is hoping to keep open the prospect of unification and may get frustrated and may make aggressive moves, maybe up to and including a military invasion. We don't know. There's a lot of other things, let me mention, that they could do short of a military invasion. So I find the discussion of what would happen in a military invasion by China to be a little bit lopsided as far as what the kinds of realistic scenarios we should be discussing. But you know, on the Taiwan side, they have domestic politics. It's a vibrant and successful democracy, and they have pressures, and they are always moving in different ways to do different things. And the US recently, of course, has undertaken a number of actions, I think still well within the framework of our one China policy, but certainly coming closer and closer to a line that China at least perceives is there. So I think all of this is getting to the point where people are feeling exercised. There's no communication really between the US and China on this, and there's really no communication between China and Taiwan, which is really the place where we ought to be focusing our efforts, I think, and talking more about what is being intended by these various moves and try to make sure that there are not any misperceptions. I mean, I think beefing up deterrence, the US and Taiwan have the right approach, which is to harden and beef up Taiwan security, make more capabilities available to US forces to sort of be available in any kind of contingency. And that may involve, you know, our forces in Japan. We don't know, but it's a possibility, and that needs to be discussed. But I think communication among the parties directly involved is probably the best short-term way to try to dial down the rheostat on this a little bit.
Great, thank you. We could stick with this topic forever, but so Kitaoka-sensei?
One more. Can I say one more minute?
Yes, please.
Tsutsui-san?
Yes.
I just spoke about the extreme case, but basically speaking, China is really a cautious country. They will not start real aggression until they feel they are clearly overwhelming the opponent. And then now, in reality, on the military basis, China is now prevailing. But therefore, what we have to do is that let China do not think that they are clearly overwhelming the West. So what's very simply stated, we have to strengthen our deterrence power together with the United States and Taiwan.
Great, thank you. Now moving on to the neighbors issues, there seems to be a consensus that issues with North Korea or Russia, they're not gonna move forward anytime soon. So sticking with focusing on South Korea. To Susan, maybe you can speak a little bit about your experience dealing with this probably for American audiences somewhat really unreasonable debates about history issues, unreasonable on both sides, a very emotionally charged issue of the history issues. And I think in the end, with the Comfort Women Agreement and all that, I heard that some in South Korea feel like the United States has taken a Japan side on this issue. But I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how U.S. foreign policy diplomats go about trying to intervene, but resolve this kind of discussion between two allies. And to Kitaoka-sensei, a question from Dan Snyder. It has been reported that Prime Minister Suga will not attend a planned trilateral meeting of leaders from China, Japan, and South Korea if in Seoul, unless South Korea changes its policy on historical issues. What is the logic of that stance? And doesn't that encourage those forces in South Korea that are more pro-China. So I think I'll go to Susan first on this.
Oh, well, there's a red siren light whirring behind my head, warning me to not step in the middle of this question between two US allies. And it's a very painful issue, obviously, for us in the US. I mean, we look at our partnership with both Japan and Korea as being based on sort of, bedrock alliance, security concerns, but also values and just the way we think about things. So to see, Japan and Korea have this kind of a dust up is really distressing to us. And not only is it distressing just because of the fact of the dispute, but also it does get in the way of us being able to do things together that would be beneficial to all three countries, of course. So, I said earlier that I don't think there's a way for the US to get substantively into the middle of this issue. But what we have done in the past is we have promoted trilateral cooperation that helps all three sides, but particularly Japan and Korea, come together and talk about things, not this specific issue, but working on things together, either, global issues or security issues or any other issues that we have in common. Doing shuttle diplomacy. I know in the Obama administration, Tony Blinken was involved in making twice annual trips for TCOG meetings between the three partners to discuss all kinds of areas of cooperation. And lots can be done on the sidelines of those kind of meetings to encourage, movement or progress or better communication on any number of issues. And I think that's the kind of thing that the US might be able to do if we got some more active diplomacy going in the region. I think, basically on the issue of not going to meetings, I mean, I'm a diplomat. I spent 3 decades. Ambassador Kitaoka was also a diplomat. There's almost no problem that gets better by not talking. So I really am not a fan of this kind of weaponization of dialogue or trying to withhold dialogue as some kind of a stick or a carrot or something in a negotiation. So, I would certainly not be an advocate of not, showing up or not talking because this issue is getting so much in the way. I think especially between two kind of like-minded partners like Japan and Korea, there ought to be ways to communicate and get through this.
Okay, responding to Dan Schneider. I hear also that Prime Minister Suga is not going to attend the tripartite meeting in South Korea. I'm not sure if it's true or not. But actually, today's understanding is that South Korea has been violating the agreement on the workers during wartime, which was solved in the Treaty of 1965. That's our understanding. So this is widely shared by most of the Japanese people here. Then that means if we are going to attend, if he is going to attend that meeting, then that would be used as Japan's accepting the violation of South Korean violation of the core part of 1965 treaty. That's why that's why Mr. Suga is not going to attend that meeting.
Certainly a very thorny issue that we're not going to resolve here. Moving on to the point regional politics, FOIP, and the Western Pacific Union idea. Question from John Cherry at the University of Michigan. This idea of a Western Pacific Union of Southeast Asian governments, but Southeast Asian governments, they often emphasize their interest in ASEAN centrality and their desire to avoid taking sides among larger external powers, US and China, Japan. How might they be enticed to participate in a union that could marginalize ASEAN and be regarded as siding with Japan against China? I guess this is to Kitaoka sensei. Yeah.
Yes, that's a very important question. Definitely, my idea is just to counter the idea of consolidating free and open Indo-Pacific. Free and open Indo-Pacific cannot be a monolithic entity. That's my idea. Though the ASEAN people do not like to choose between China or the United States. They are willing to be away from that conflict. But at the same time, they are not willing to be overwhelmed by China. Japan is not competing our influence over ASEAN countries. We are just trying to support their independence, development, solidarity, and so forth. No country is willing to be the subordinate to any big country. And that's our strong point. Then this is, those countries are divided to some extent. The Vietnam is very much anti-China and pro-Japan. And Indonesia, we are more trusted by China than China, but still the margin is not very big. And in Philippines, the US is regarded the most important country, followed by Japan and China. Therefore, US, Japan combined, we can overwhelm the Philippines. And likewise, on the other hand, Cambodia is under the influence of China very much. On the other hand, I could ask where ASEAN centrality will bring those countries to the future. And then that's important until now. But if they are willing to have more voice in the world, then that would be a good idea to be together with Japan. And also, we have had a long history of offshore development assistance, as well as Japan's accumulation of Japanese business over ASEAN regions. So according to another opinion poll in ASEAN countries, Japan, in most of the ASEAN countries, Japan is the most trusted country than any other countries. So based on this, we can strengthen our approach. On the other hand, the United States is supporting the concept of a free and open Indo-Pacific. But the US is not willing to provide any money or financial assistance. Therefore, that's the role of Japan to provide financial assistance to ASEAN countries. And also, we have to, accelerate our cooperation with India, because India is now under COVID-19. They are falling into a very difficult situation. So that's why JICA has started a global initiative for health and medicine. The core of that concept is to build 100 hospitals in developing countries by JICA initiative. We have now just started. One of the main focus is India.
Thank you. To Susan now, Professor Kitaoka's idea is to have this union excluding not just China, but the United States. Would something like that be acceptable to the United States? And to add one more question from the audience, I forgot the name of the questioner. There seems to be two different understandings about FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific, in the US and in Japan. Could you talk a little bit about the differences you see in the way Japan conceptualizes FOIP and the United States understands the FOIP to be? Two questions.
Okay. Well, I think, there is a lot of architecture already in East Asia. We have APEC, which is it's a very large economic focused organization, but it is quite flexible. And it also includes Taiwan and Hong Kong. So that's also useful in some cases. We have, of course, the ARF, ASEAN-based meetings and several mini-lateral formats under the ASEAN Regional Forum. We have the East Asia Summit, which the US just joined, under the Obama administration and stepped up its involvement there. And I think, what you're hearing now in these ideas about the Quad, the Middle Power Quad, the Western Union, an Asian version of OSCE, is some frustration over, I guess, the lack of kind of effective progress that some of these bigger regional organizations are able to get on some of the issues that matter to some of the key players in the region. On the question of whether or not the US would be okay being left out of some regional organization, I think that it would depend on what it was and who was leading it and what the what the idea was there. If it was something that was useful and helpful, then I don't think that we would have a problem with it. I do think, having been in recent conversations with a number of ASEANs, I mean, a lot of them talk about inclusivity. They are very reluctant, it seems, to have it be seen that they are excluding people or trying to create, you know, blocks or divisions, especially within ASEAN. And so I think that is a particular sensitivity there, and would probably come into play in any kind of thing we would try to organize in this way. But, you know, I think as far as the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy goes, the difference between Japan's approach and the US approach, I mean, really the US approach is about openness and access. I think Japan's is much more focused. They have a much more systematic kind of vision of the entire region. It involves economic assistance, as Ambassador Kitaoka was saying, involves a number of different aspects, whereas the US concept is really more focused on sort of access and knitting together the various security partnerships that we have in the region to make them more flexible and effective, and not so much focused on the sort of economic outreach. And as the ambassador said, we haven't come up with any money, so it makes sense that maybe it's not focused on that. We've tended to have more money for security partnerships, and so we've really sort of focused on that aspect of our approach to the region, and maybe not as much on the economic assistance and infrastructure building part.
Thank you. I'm mindful of the time, and so once again, thank you very much. And to the audience, thank you for participating. I apologize to those of you whose questions I couldn't bring up in the discussion, but we do appreciate your participation very much. Thank you again, Professor Kitaoka and Professor Thornton.